Hi my loves. It's been such a long time since I did a book video. We have so much to catch up on. We're doing January to March books today. I know it's coming to the end of April. If you haven't seen my little update vlog where I have a chat to you about where I've been, what I've been up to, what I've been thinking in my little brain, I'll leave a link to that down below. But let's get into it because this is going to be a long one anyway. My hair doesn't look great. And that's the end of that. So my Patreon is not ready, my loves. It's not ready. I talk a little bit about why in that vlog. But let's pick back up on book club because it's just been too long. So I've picked something, don't know if it's going to be controversial, but it's a kind of modern classic that I have wanted to read for a while. I bought it, I think, over a year ago. And it is Don DeLillo's White Noise. I have read one Don DeLillo before. Yes, 0K, which is a much more recent novel, I believe. I'm not sure. This one is from the 80s, so be warned. It's from the 80s. Sometimes that means there's some unsavoury stuff. Jack Gladney is the creator and chairman of Hitler Studies at the College on the Hill. This is the story of his absurd life, a life that is going well enough until a chemical spill from a rail car releases an airborne toxic event and Jack is forced to confront his biggest fear, his own mortality. So that's White Noise. I also really love this cover. I think they've done, Picador's done a few of these Don DeLillo books with these covers. That is that. Moving on, swiftly on to the books, some of which I feel like I read an age ago. There's so many here and so many of them are absolutely fantastic, so you're in for a ride today. I'm going to try and not make this super long, so but I think, I don't want to big them up, but my written reviews are a little bit more detailed, so if you would like to read those, they're always linked down below. There's going to be two blog posts. A January books blog post because I wrote it ages ago, meaning to then combine it with my February books, which never happened, but the January books works well as a complete entity. So there's January books and then there's February, March books. So yeah, I'm going to try not to be too slow here. But anyway, at the end of last year, I had started too many books and was halfway through too many books. So I decided to just not start any new books until I had finished everything else on my currently reading list. And I was a little bit nervous about it, but it actually worked out so well. But I think what I'm going to do today is sort of follow the same pattern. So I'm going to talk about my January books as a kind of complete set, and then I will move on to the February and March books. But there are some fantastic books in the February and March books, so stick around because yes, I'm excited to talk about them. I mentioned this in my last video as well, but I recently started writing a quarterly roundup for the Sunday Times on speculative fiction. So obviously a few of the books I've read in here are like brand new releases that were part of that article, so that will happen in the future. I'm trying to keep up with like my own reading as well because like I said before, I really want to be reading more backlist titles in general. I don't want to be reading too many new releases, but then of course I started doing this and now I'm reading a lot of new releases again. Also, some of my most anticipated books of the year came out in this kind of first quarter. Actually, some of them aren't out yet. I've been reading those as well. Anyway, this is such a long and boring ramble, so let's get into the books. Hi my loves, me from the future here. I was watching this back, and so the first books I talk about here are the Proust books that I read in the last few months. So I read one in January and one in March, I believe. And I really liked the one I read in January, The Gamantis Way, which was obviously part of my little task to finish up books that I've been reading for a long time because I'd been reading that for like 6+ months. And then I read Sodom and Gomorrah and I did not like it at all. And they were sitting here at the beginning of the video and I just thought, I know there must be a couple of you invested in my Proust journey, but I've talked about Proust extensively in the past. Because obviously I've been reading In Search of Lost Time for like 2 years now, and I have written reviews of both of them, so I'm just going to leave the written reviews down below, and if you are interested in the continuation of my journey with Proust, then you can read those. But I just thought we would skip right into the other books. But yes, just an explanation as to where the Proust is. If you are wondering, I decided to cut him. I listened to Klara and the Sun, which has got a coffee mark on it. Let me just try and take that off. First of all, I think it worked as an audiobook, but I do very much wonder, with this controversial novel that really seems to split the crowd, what my experience would have been like had I read it, not listened to it. Because I thought about that because I read The Buried Giant, which also had a sort of mixed reaction from readers and lovers of Ishiguro's work. And I ended up liking The Buried Giant, and I think my conclusion was that I'm not particularly enamoured or overawed by Klara and the Sun. When I was writing my review, I was like, oh, maybe there is more to this. But I kind of instantly forget I've read it when I finish talking about it. So I think that probably means this isn't my favourite Ishiguro by any stretch of the imagination. Not quite for me, but anyway. Yeah, if you don't know, it has received quite mixed reviews. Some people seem to really get it. A lot of people seem to think it's kind of very shallow. It's about a robot or an AI who basically they fashion these AIs to be companions to children who seem to no longer go to traditional schools for whatever reason. I don't know if it's like, I can't quite remember to be honest, but like health reasons, set in the future, right? So some sort of reason why kids don't go to proper schools anymore and mix and be normal, so they need companions, and these companions are robots. And Klara is one such robot, and it's narrated from her point of view. So that's where a lot of the problem comes in for a lot of people, because you're seeing everything through her eyes. So for some people that doesn't really work because it makes it too shallow, because it's sort of like a kind of quite pared back narration. For others, including myself, when I think about it, I think there's more complexity to her narration than there first appears, but you have to look quite closely. She also seems to sort of worship the sun, and a lot of readers take that at face value. For me, I thought it maybe had something interesting to say about faith and the type of being that Klara is. Obviously the novel's called Klara and the Sun, so that relationship is quite important, but it's quite easy to skip over it. I think what's most interesting in this book is to look at what it says about Klara rather than what she is saying about everything around her. Because if you're reading for plot, if you're reading for everyone else, I don't think you're going to enjoy it as much. But if you are reading for her and the way she sees her world and what Ishiguro is doing there, I think it's quite interesting. I think this novel kind of suffers from the just abundance of dystopian literature out there, because if you read it against all of that, it seems very simple. It seems very like it's been done before. Sorry, I'm really squirming around today, but I'm really uncomfortable. So yes, as happened when I wrote my review, I start off thinking, ugh, I'm not that bothered about this book, and then I start launching a defence of it. But yes, I don't know. I think if you're an Ishiguro fan and you're invested in his writing, you should read it, because it's kind of part of his evolution as a writer, as part of his oeuvre. I have a few more of his to read, but I will definitely be reading them all. He's an author that I find very intriguing. I didn't really love the second half of the book. I think it gets derailed, the final point. But anyway, that's Klara and the Sun. Take from my review what you will. Still not sure what to conclude about it. Okay, now we're gonna get on to the really good stuff. Don't know why I started with those books, I shouldn't have, but we're getting on to the good stuff now. Starting with the weird, a compendium of strange and dark stories. So this is one of the books that I had to finish before I could start any new books. Look at it. There's columns. The writing is tiny. There's like 1,100 pages. There are hundreds of thousands of words. So this was quite, I was a little bit apprehensive. I was like, am I ever going to finish this? I loved it. I loved reading all the stories back to back. So obviously it's an anthology of weird stories. The weird being a kind of interesting genre. Is it a genre? Is it not a genre? I think it is. But it brings together lots of things from speculative fiction, horror, sci-fi, fantasy, all of those are represented in this book. Also, like, there's a lot of realism in here with kind of uncanny elements. There's lots going on in this book, and I absolutely loved the process of reading it. I am going to attempt another of these anthologies at some point in the future, maybe next year. I know that seems ridiculous, that I'm like, maybe I'll read one next year, but we're already in April and I have no idea how we got here. So, and it is quite, as you can imagine, the commitment to read one of these. But yeah, I had been reading it for ages, like a story here and there, and I was just not getting anywhere. So I just decided to plough through and I loved it. Would highly recommend. This is organised in chronological order of when the stories were published, not when the authors were active. So yes, here we go from... my last video was actually a little bit of a reading blog about the end of this, wasn't it? So we go from 1908 through to 2010. There's a couple of authors that get a couple of stories in here, but most are by different authors, some of which we'll be really familiar with. Ray Bradbury, Shirley Jackson, George R.R. Martin, Octavia Butler, Ben Okri, Haruki Murakami, Stephen King, Angela Carter, Neil Gaiman. Those people are all represented here, but also we've got so many authors I'd never heard of before, but who I am very excited to read now. As I said in that vlog, I didn't really start loving any of the stories at all, so it was a bit of a slog up until the 70s. That's kind of a personal thing to me. Maybe you will like the earlier stories if you like literature from the early part of the 20th century, but it is not really my cup of tea, especially when it comes to like fantasy and sci-fi and stuff. I just much prefer everything from the 70s onwards. But when we got there, there were so many hits in here. Obviously there were some misses as well for me, but I think it's a really fantastic anthology that will give you a wonderful overview of the genre, of so many amazing authors. I'm in awe at the amount that Jeff and Anne VanderMeer must have read in order to create this and all of their other anthologies. Okay, on to my February and March books now. So many fantastic books in here. Starting with Moonwitch Spider King, which I was so excited to read. It is now out for you to read too, by Marlon James. So this second instalment in the Dark Star trilogy, following on from Black Leopard Red Wolf, is narrated by Sogolon, who Sogolon and Tracker don't really get on very well with each other. In fact, they kind of hate each other. So we're getting a totally different perspective in this novel, and also we're getting a female perspective. And I have to say, it is wonderful to get a female perspective on this one. So what we do in this one is we actually backtrack and we get Sogolon's kind of life story leading up to Black Leopard Red Wolf, and this kind of mysterious mission that Sogolon and Tracker and a number of other characters are put on, which is to find a missing boy who may or may not be a king. Now, pretty much everyone who's read this one has said that this is a much kind of tauter, cleaner read, and it's much more kind of focused. It's less hallucinogenic, and it's propelled by its plot, and it just makes for a smoother, easier read. So I think that will appeal to a lot of readers. I did ask myself, is some of the kind of power of James's prose lost in that? But I don't think so. I think you still get a lot of it coming through, and I think that that style also allows him to really lean into the kind of fantasy world and allow for some of his world building to really kind of form in front of our eyes, and for us to really appreciate the world that he's created. So the novels seem to kind of be asking questions about the narrative process. So the first one's very much about truth. What's true? What's not true? Does it matter? Who does it matter to? Why does it matter? This one's very much seems to be about memory, identity and storytelling, and kind of the narratives that we make for ourselves, and of course the relationship between those two things. And as with all of Marlon James's writing, there's a lot of violence and brutality here, so be warned, if you don't like violent books, you are not gonna, and to be honest, neither do I most of the time. I think it works in his particular brand of writing. But yeah, if you don't like violent books, Marlon James's work is not for you. The relationship between violence and power is like at the core of most of his work. Yeah, it's chock full of plot, this one. It makes for really kind of compulsive reading, which is really nice, and I am so excited for the final installment. I'm very interested to see where it goes next, because there were some conclusions made at the end of this book. Maybe I forgot them from the last book, but there were some conclusions made which made me think, like, what on earth is going to happen next? So I really am excited to see where he goes and how he finishes off the trilogy. He also said himself that you could read this one before Black Leopard Red Wolf. I do wonder what my experience of reading Black Leopard Red Wolf would have been like had I read this one first, because like I said, this one gives you a much clearer idea of what is going on, and I think maybe that would help you cut through some of the more difficult moments of Black Leopard Red Wolf. So something to think about definitely if you're coming to the trilogy as a new reader. But yes, definitely a fan of this one. Next up we've got Lambda, which is also out now, by David Musgrave. This is a debut novel. David Musgrave is a visual artist. I find it really hard to talk about this book because it's quite an unusual one. It's very innovative, it's interesting, and I really enjoyed it. It's set in an alternative Britain in which there is a population, a small population of lambdas who are an aquatic people, but they're genetically related to humans. They're closely genetically related, and they kind of resemble newborns, which is kind of weird. And they end up living and working amongst humans, living, you know, in basements, in swimming pools. And obviously, it being a modern British society, there's a lot of tension between the lambdas and the humans. And then there is this catastrophic bombing of a school, which is claimed by the Army of Lambda Ascension, the ALA. This obviously leads to a ramping up of tensions, of anti-Lambda sentiment. So that's the storyline that the blurb describes, but there are a few narratives that we follow which are kind of tenuously related to that story, and which provides the context to, not tenuously, are related to that story, and that kind of provides an overview of what this book is looking at. But through the three narratives? I think it's three narratives. We look at a huge multitude of things, including, you know, relationships between lambdas and humans. But anyway, the main character, the protagonist of the kind of main narrative arc, is called Klara. She initially works in kind of an anti-terrorism sector in the police, monitoring data and stuff. It's under her watch that this bombing happens, and then she is moved into a kind of Lambda liaison role. So Musgrave is not just interested in the lambdas, but also all sorts of things. We've got sentient objects. Kara's narrative is told by an auto-narrator, which, as you can imagine, makes it kind of deliberately clunky. It picks up on things that a kind of human narrator wouldn't, and maybe leaves out other things, so you're kind of doing a little bit of detective work. There's like a new republic out in the desert somewhere, which is ruled by these kind of criminal hacker types, and that seems to have a big influence on international relations. So yeah, there's so many things looked at in this. Sometimes I wondered, is the style a bit gimmicky, because each of the three narratives that we see over the course of the novel have a kind of very particular techie style to them. But I concluded that the novel was so clever in so many ways. I can usually tell because I write a lot of notes when I think a novel is kind of complex and clever, and I had pages on this book. I think it saved itself from being gimmicky. I think it instead just achieved its ends and what Musgrave kind of wanted to get across. So a major theme seems to be about kind of origins. So we get discussion of how we feel about our origins, our relationship to our origins with humans and our parents, with lambdas who have a kind of murky sense of their origins, and with machines who have a completely different relationship to their origins. You know, what does it mean to incorporate so much technology in our lives? How does that interact with our biology, our sense of ourselves as historical beings? I described it as a bit of a Frankenstein's monster of a book, because it kind of feels deliberately kind of stilted and awkward and techy, but it's packed full of ideas. It's really, really clever, and I was really excited to read it. I'm so interested to see what he writes next, if anything, and whether that kind of style is like innate to him, or whether that was kind of specific to this book and what he'll write next. I just have no idea. It's like one of those kind of mystery books for me. Couldn't really get a grasp on Musgrave at all as an author, which I think is actually really hard to do, to really like disguise yourself entirely and really create the world of the book by itself. So I was impressed and really, really enjoyed it. So I would definitely recommend that one. Next up we've got The Doloriad by Missouri Williams, which is another debut that I read and recommended in my ST article. It's completely different but also really, really good. But like Lambda, it will be a bit polarising. I think not everyone will kind of connect with this book, and the same is certainly true of this one. It's about a family at the end of the world. Some kind of apocalypse has happened, and this family is being led by the matriarch, and she wants to repopulate the world in her image. Yes, using her children and a little bit of incest. So yeah, not everyone's gonna like this. And it's sort of about the old ways of the matriarch coming into conflict with the new ways of the new world, as her children sort of increasingly become more and more alien to her, and they become like new beings basically, and new ways of being and being human in this unreal, kind of unfamiliar post-apocalyptic world. The prose is very dreamlike. It's kind of thick and sticky and gross, and the world is full of sucking mud, and the prose kind of mirrors that. It's not super kind of plot heavy. That is what I described as kind of the overall movement of the plot. But yeah, it's very atmospheric, very kind of absurd a lot of the time. It's grotesque, and this is most definitely kind of literary fiction. If you don't like that kind of literary feel in books, which I totally understand, sometimes I'm not in the mood for it myself, you probably won't like this one because it's all about the prose, and there's a lot actually happening thematically in this book. It's really, really interesting. It would make a fantastic study. But that doesn't mean it's always like super enjoyable to read, and you really kind of have to focus on the sentences and the world that Williams is creating, but it is masterful. And again, I'm so interested to see what she writes next. Like, as a debut, this is stunning. It's so, so good, but it is also a bit disgusting, so just be warned. And I really, really love the ending as well. There's nothing about this which is shallow or superficial, which I find with a lot of literary fiction. It claims to be literary, but it's actually thematically and under the surface of the words, there's actually not that much going on. With this, it's all there. Okay, I don't have a physical copy of this book, and I'll tell you why. Because I've read it on my Kindle, and it is actually out in paperback, so I could buy it, but I really want the American copy, and I'm going to America this year, so I'm going to wait to buy it in America. The cover's just so much nicer. But anyway, it's A Passage North by Anuk Arudpragasam. This was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. I don't think I'll go into them here. I'll just let you read on my blog if you want to. But because I've finally learnt to put down books that I don't really like, if there's any DNFs, which is did not finish, for those of you not in the book term knowledge, if there's any significant DNFs, like things that I think maybe would surprise you that I didn't finish, or that people will ask me if I've read, I'll put them on the blog and say why I didn't finish them. I won't put everything I kind of start and don't finish on there because there's a lot these days, but anything significant I'll put on there. And one of the significant things from the past few months was The Promise by Damon Galgut, which won the Booker last year. I did not like that book, so yes, and I've got a couple years of reading Man Booker long lists under my belt now, so I'm sufficiently wary, shall we say, of reading things that have been Booker longlisted or shortlisted or even have won the prize, and thinking this isn't fantastic in my opinion. But anyway, so I stopped reading The Promise, didn't like it, and A Passage North was also on my personal shortlist of things that were nominated for the book last year, which I sort of put together through a little bit of review reading and reading between the lines on the reviews as well. I thought this one might be for me, and thankfully it really was, and I absolutely loved it. Loved it. Didn't have high expectations after my experience with The Promise, but this one is so nice. This is a gorgeously written, thoughtful book. Generous, beautiful, kind-hearted, interesting, just loved it. So Arudpragasam is a Sri Lankan author, and this book is set in Sri Lanka. It's about a young man called Krishan who works for an NGO in Colombo. He has to go to the funeral of his grandmother's caretaker, who lives in the north of Sri Lanka, which was the setting of the Sri Lankan Civil War. And so there's lots of discussion about the Sri Lankan Civil War, and this is one of those novels that's like hyper specific, very much about Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan Civil War, and Krishan's experience as a relatively privileged citizen looking on. But it's also really universal, and it's like examination of the human heart and you know, what it means to be human, falling in love, aging, trauma, family life, you know, moving from place to place. So he uses these long sentences and paragraphs to narrate Krishan's inner world. So again, there is not a lot of plot happening here. It's really about the inner workings of Krishan's mind, basically. And having just read The Gamanta's Way when I had started this, I instantly felt it to be Proustian. I think it's something that other people have commented on as well. It has the same goals, I guess, which is to explore the outer world but through the inner life of its narrator. Krishan talks about books he's read, poems he's read, documentaries he's watched. So we get some of that. We also get a lot of reflection on what's happened in his life. And I think the long sentences, it's so hard to do them right in a way that's readable, which maybe you couldn't say of Proust, but I guess I'm a contemporary reader and he was writing at a different time. Arudpragasam really nails it. Like, I think he finds the balance with them being kind of beautiful, lyrical, but also being readable, and the way that you might think and speak yourself, because of course we don't speak in complete perfect sentences. We speak in kind of long rambling sentences, we think in long rambling sentences, and I think he just pitches it just perfectly, that it flows nicely, there's a nice rhythm to it. Yes, there's lots of things which make it unlike Proust. Mostly it's just like generosity to all the characters, it's warmth, it's very relevant themes. Sometimes when I'm reading Proust I think to myself, like, why couldn't he have written about something more interesting? Because the writing is great, but what he's writing about is just like, sometimes it's just like, no. Whereas I think with this book, you're really getting the best of everything, of all the worlds. And yes, you know, I don't always love a lot of literary fiction, a lot of fiction without a strong plot. Well, I do, but I have high standards for things that have less plot and are very reflective, and this one just hit the nail on the head. The prose is so lovely, the themes and the thoughts are so sensitively explored. I just think it's such a gem of the book. Next we have Woman Eating, a literary vampire novel by Kohda. Another debut, so many good debuts at the moment. Yes, so I'm typically a bit wary of the kind of depressed woman millennial theme in literature. There's a lot of it out there, a lot of it isn't great, and it's just generally not my thing. But revamped as a vampire novel by Kohda, I loved it. I thought it was so clever. We are running out of memory card space here, because I'm just rambling on today. But anyway, as I was reading this, I thought to myself, kind of reads like Elif Batuman's The Idiot if it was a vampire novel and much shorter. But then I listened to The Idiot again and I was like, maybe not so much, but it's kind of got the same feel, you know, when the main character is kind of a bit hopeless, and just a bit useless at life, and you're just like, that is very relatable. I did a couple of rereads in audiobook form. Piranesi was one, The Idiot was another, and enjoyed them. But anyway, so Lydia has just left her vampire mother, who's kind of forgetting who she is, in an old people's home, and she moves to London from, I can't remember if it's Margate or somewhere like Margate, and she moves to London. She wants to be an artist, so she's got herself an internship, and she is trying to make a life for herself, but she is very hungry because she no longer has access to it's pig's blood that they eat, her and her mother, that she would usually eat. Yes, she's dealing with all the kind of typical 20-something things. She has a very creepy boss. She has confusing feelings for a boy in her building, who has a girlfriend, of course. She's got a lack of direction, she's got a lack of funds. And then, yeah, she's dealing with this all-consuming hunger at the same time. So there's not a lot of high drama here, but I really loved following Lydia around. Thought there was lots of clever elements in here. I thought the vampire integration was great. I liked how Kohda really explored how like integral food is to our lives. I mean, it's something that you sort of maybe take for granted unless it's pointed out to you for whatever reason. But Lydia is also mixed race, so she is part Malaysian, part Japanese, and also has been brought up in the UK. So she's dealing with all of that, and she feels alienated from her culture because of her inability to eat normal human food. She also can't interact in kind of a normal way with other people her age because of her relationship with food. So I thought that all of that exploration was really interesting. One of the things I really like about this book, and which is different from, say, the Doloriad, is that it wears its kind of literariness very lightly. It's still very readable. One isn't better than the other for that reason, but just it depends kind of what mood you're in. So if you want something a little bit lighter but that's still really clever and still has a lot of exploration of interesting themes, then Woman Eating is for you. If you want something that's really incredible prose and just a little bit more dense, but also really, really interesting, then something like the Doloriad is for you. You know, they're just very different books. But yeah, I liked how this one felt lighter. It still could be substantial, like a substantial bite to eat, but in a more readable way. Yes, I'm very interested to see what she writes next. I'm very excited to see what she writes next, because this was a definite success for me. Next, we have The This by Adam Roberts. Look, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but I definitely judged this book by its cover. Looking back at it now, I think it's a joke about, you know, that Twitter meme, which, like, you know, it starts off small with like a picture and then there's like pictures like this which get increasingly more dramatic. I think it's kind of based on that, but when you look at it, it just looks kind of ridiculous. Somehow I've never come across Adam Roberts before, but he's kind of a prolific sci-fi author. He's written absolutely shed loads of books. Like I said, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but I was like, But then I opened this book up, I read the first few pages and I was like, interesting. So yes, I started reading it and I ended up really liking it, thinking it was a very clever book. It is based on Hegelian philosophy, Hegel's philosophies. Yeah, had to do a little bit of Googling. It's been a long time. I've not been in university quite a few years now. I would recommend you do a little bit of Googling before you read this book, or just like in the, you know, when you first start it, because it does help a little bit, I think. But another thing that's nice about this book is that it's not, you think, oh god, it's based on Hegelian philosophy, like that sounds pretentious and painful to read, and I was worried about that, but it turned out to be really readable. Again, it kind of wears it relatively lightly, and even though this novel feels a bit chaotic, but in a kind of readable way. So it is about a social media network called The This, which is essentially hands-free Twitter, which, depending on your thoughts about Twitter, sounds innocuous enough until you think, it's kind of like being telepathic with a huge hive mind. And yeah, a huge hive mind comes into being. It's cult-like, it's scary. There's a few narratives going on here, a few different things happening. One of the main ones is based around a guy called Rich, who is a writer living in London. He's kind of a bit of a loser. For some reason, becomes the target of a very aggressive recruitment campaign for this. I wonder why this is happening, and it slowly becomes revealed over the course of the rest of the pages. It's it's like relaxed. I don't know quite how to describe it. When I read Lambda, for instance, I'm doing a lot of comparisons today, it doesn't feel relaxed because I don't think it's supposed to feel relaxed. It feels kind of awkward. Like I said, it's kind of like a Frankenstein's monster of a book. Whereas this one, although there's a lot going on, and like I said, it's kind of chaotic and all sorts of things happen in it, the writing feels relaxed. I don't know if that's just because Adam Rumps has been writing for a long time, or it's just his style or whatever, but it's smooth. It feels smooth to read. It's a really clever book. If you're like a philosopher, maybe you'll really enjoy it. I'll be reading more Adam Roberts, I think. Moving on to Trust by Hernan Diaz. Obviously, this is not the real copy, this is a proof, so yours will not look like this. This is out on the 4th of August, so there's a little bit of a wait still for this one. So if you don't know, I loved Diaz's first novel, In the Distance. Loved it. It's like a reimagined Western. This one is very different, but he is similarly interested in sort of the American dream, I suppose, or stuff that makes up the myth of America. Because this one is about 1920s New York. Lots of reviews have said it's kind of like a tribute to Edith Wharton. I have not read any, so I couldn't say. Yes, I was so excited to get my hands on a copy of this, and I really did like it a lot. However, I think because I had such high expectations of it, I do have a few caveats. But yes, I think it's just because I loved In the Distance so much, and for some reason that book really spoke to my heart. But this one, a little bit less so. However, I still really liked it. I still think it's a very clever book. Like I said, it is set in 1920s New York, that kind of early 20th century New York. It actually moves around quite a lot, so you don't just stay there. Anyway, it's about a couple, Andrew and Mildred Bethel. He has made an absolute, gargantuan fortune on the stock market. Just one of those sort of mythical people, so this is where this comes in, who just has wealth beyond what you could even imagine. This has been described as a literary puzzle because it's 4 books which kind of talk to one another and reveal this couple as their kind of truest selves over the course of the book. So you're kind of looking at all these different takes on this couple. I loved the exploration of fiction, of money as the ultimate fiction, at how therefore money, an immense amount of money, can bend and shape reality, the fictions that shape our world. I liked how the kind of multiple narratives actually seem to reveal something truer than even the kind of true narratives. But yes, so this book didn't have the heart that I loved so much about In the Distance. I think with In the Distance you really feel for the main character, and you kind of follow him so closely, and he's sympathetic. With this one, I just couldn't find it in my heart to care too much about the financiers of early 20th century New York. It's not where my interests lie. The reason I haven't read any Edith Wharton is because it doesn't really appeal to me. So that's just that's a me problem, not really a this novel problem. I think it will appeal to a lot of people. Also, and I think this is mainly because it has been described as a literary puzzle, and I was really expecting to have to do a little bit of work, which is something that I actually typically enjoy with a novel like this. I actually think, first of all, that he does a little bit too much over-explanation. I like when I have to do the work, so sometimes I felt like it was a little oversimplified. And also Mildred, who's actually really the heart of this novel. That's where I think your sympathies would lie if you had them. She comes a little bit too little, too late. She is shrouded in too much mystery for too long, because this is like 400 pages, and we only get her right at the end, like right at the very, very, very end. yeah, for the last 50 pages. So I think there was too little of her for me. Yeah, and also finally, Diaz really occupies like different voices here. You know, he's doing different modes, and so I felt like I really missed his voice, which I know in the distance he's inhabiting a style as well, but I feel like I missed his narrative style rather than him kind of copying another style, if you know what I mean. Sort of like I said with Lambda, I don't really get a feel of David Musgrave's actual writing style, like his natural style. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's something that I missed in this. Anyway, I'll continue to read anything that Diaz ever publishes. This was still a very clever novel, had a lot of interesting things to say, like I said, about fiction, about money, but just didn't capture my heart as much, you know. Right, my loves, we are still going here. We are still going. A few more books to go. Right, my loves, just had to take a break, charge the camera for a minute, and I decided to powder my face. So if I'm looking less shiny, that is why. Moving on to Harlem Shuffle by Colson Whitehead. I will read anything that Whitehead writes after The Nickel Boys, which I thought was a real masterpiece. He is on my list of authors, which I will just read anything they write and hope for the best. Unfortunately, Harlem Shuffle was not my favourite of his works, but it was good, it just wasn't great, and I feel like it will have an audience, this one, but just wasn't me. It's about Ray Carney, who is the owner of a furniture store in 1960s Harlem. He is also kind of a part-time crook, and basically we follow Ray over kind of 3 sort of criminal activities, plots, I suppose, but they are pretty small time. They're not like, you know, really big Ocean's 11 type of heists. They're not like super dramatic. The best things about this book, there are some gorgeous sentences, Whitehead style, very beautiful. The depiction of Harlem is nice, and it creates the atmosphere. But beyond that, I couldn't really connect with it. I didn't really understand why we were having like 3 separate scenarios. I felt like I just wanted more connection in the narrative so that you could really get behind Ray, because otherwise I couldn't really connect with the plot. Yeah, I just don't think the kind of career criminal focus is kind of my thing, or maybe I just need it to be more high drama. If you're going to go career criminal, you're going to go big, you know. So yes, not my favourite Whitehead, but I will continue to read whatever he writes. I think I've got some of his early books still to read. Next up we've got Wivenhoe or Wivenhoe, I'm not entirely sure because I think it's an actual real place. I'm very sorry if you're from there and I'm mispronouncing it. By Samuel Fisher. I think if this book had been any longer, I probably would have given up with it. Probably should have done so anyway. But because it's kind of short, I was like, by the time I realised I wasn't really enjoying it, it felt like it was too late. But this is a perfectly good book. There's some nice prose in it, there's some nice landscape description, but I read so many fantastic books over the past few months that it kind of paled in comparison. It describes the Essex village of Wivenhoe, in a sort of near future timeline where the Gulf Stream has dropped off for whatever reason and Essex is covered permanently in snow. It starts very dramatically with the whole village kind of ends up witnessing murder, or they witness the immediate aftermath of a murder, and it's about the fallout from said murder in a small community in a completely, you know, changed and alien environment. It's quite a kind of reflective book beyond that. It's not like a crime narrative or anything like that. There were some nice moments between the characters, but I think it kind of lacked real depth, real substance to what it means to live in this world, what that murder means, and it ended pretty predictably. So not my favourite one, this one. I think it will have an audience that really likes it, but as someone that reads a lot of speculative fiction, I think it just kind of, like I said, paled in comparison to some of the best. Right. Mischief Acts, another book which I definitely should have given up with, but I didn't. Mischief Acts by Zoe Gilbert. I so wanted to love this book because, yeah, I just don't love things which are folkloric, based on folklore, mythical figures. I just have such bad luck with them. I guess it's just not my kind of thing. You know, started with Everything Under by Daisy Johnson, then it was Till, now it's Mischief Acts. This is about Hernan the Hunter, or Hernie the Hunter, not entirely sure how you put it, who supposedly haunts the wood of the Great North Wood. He has antlers growing out of his head, he's sort of like a woodsman. So Gilbert uses a mixture of poetry and prose, some of which I think is real, some of it which isn't real. She has this kind of like faux introduction by a professor. So it's kind of supposed to be like a compendium of real stories about Hernan Hunter. Obviously it's not, it's a novel. Yeah, it was just it just fell victim to that thing where it's like nice stylistically, the writing is nice, the poetry is nice, lyrical, but not enough substance, not enough to grip onto in terms of character, because yeah, so she moves chronologically from 1392 all the way to 2073. So, and it felt very random, some of the jumps in time, the bits she picks out. It just, yeah, there was a little bit more you could grip onto at the end because some of the stories seemed to connect a bit more, but they just would like, it's just kind of like random stories, and the stories in themselves have to be really, really good if you are going to do that. You can't rely on the whole thing holding it up because each story is sort of self-contained, and they weren't like super amazing. So yes, sadly not for me, this one. Many people will like this, I'm sure. I just can't folklore, I just can't get to grips with it. I think it's because in order to make folklore really good, I like to reimagine it as a novel, like in a novel form. You have to basically transform them into humans because it doesn't have that human heart. Like, they're symbols, and therefore they're kind of by nature superficial because they're symbols. They're not just because they're symbolic of something. For example, with Hernan the Hunter, he's like symbolic of the woods and nature. That doesn't mean much beyond being symbolic of that, if you know what I mean. That's like kind of a 2D thing. You need humanness to make them 3D, and then you take away their folkloric sense. I think folklore works best as folklore, in my experience of reading about these figures, because otherwise they just kind of pop in and out of human lives, but they're the thing that's supposed to be tying the whole thing together. Sadly, not for me. Oh, I think that's our last book, because the last book was Sodom and Gomorrah, but we've already covered that. So that's it, my loves. I am feeling exhausted now. I hope you are not exhausted by me. I hope that that was helpful and useful. My brain is fried because so many of those books are so fantastic and complex and clever, and I haven't done them justice at all, and I want you to read them. I hope that I always just give you at least a good idea of whether you might like the book or not, because some of the books I like you're not going to like, some of the books you like I'm not going to like. But I want to make sure the right readers find the right books, because that's the most important thing of all. So yes, but there's some fantastic books, and long live my good reading year. I hope it continues. But yeah, if you haven't checked out my recent vlog, go and check that out because there's lots packed in there. Thank you so much for watching today. Hope you enjoyed. I hope we all enjoy White Noise, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.